In the previous lesson, we saw how to build our simple application using what I called a tools-driven approach or tools-driven architecture. And simply put, that means that we relied on Visual Studio's many wizards and property editors and menus and designers and things of that nature to build out our simple data-bound application. Now, again, that is a great approach if you are looking at a departmentally scoped application that you need to develop fast. There's no real logic to it. Just create, read, update, delete style operations into a database, and where you don't really anticipate any changes long term. However, not every application is like that. Many applications are not departmental but enterprise. Many applications don't necessarily require a fast turnaround. They're more interested in getting it right, and they're larger in scope, where you would anticipate ongoing changes for months or years after the release of the application, in some cases decades, where you anticipate there to be a lot of logic encoded into the application. You need a different approach. Many developers have tried to apply a tools-driven approach into the wrong scenario, and they failed miserably at it. And so this is why you need to be aware that there are two different ways to go about your approach, and many gradations in between those two. But let's just talk about two extremes. So in our application as it stands, and let's start off by saying this, that what I simply did was copy the after folder from Project 61 into the before folder of 63. So the before folder 63 is where the starting point is. So make sure you copy that. We're basically ignoring the fact that we even built out 62, the tools-driven approach. So we're back to where we were at the end of lesson number 61. And the application works. However, currently all of the concerns of the application are munged together inside of the code behind. So what we want to do to fix this and to separate out our concerns is to implement both a persistence layer and a domain layer in our solution in order to separate those concerns out as a starting point for building a maintenance-driven architectural approach. And I want you to keep an open mind during this. You're going to say, oh my goodness, there's so much effort here just to build the simple application that we built in the previous lesson. And I want you to keep an open mind that yes, for a simple application like what we're building here, this won't make a lot of sense to you. But keep an open mind that applications are not this small. They generally are, some applications, enterprise scale applications, are massive in scope. So you need a different approach. And what you're only going to see here is a lot of setup and a lot of code and not a lot of justification for a small application. So keep an open mind. Trust me, this is the right way to build out a large-scale application. And also, this is not a complete example. It's going to start you thinking about separating concerns. It's going to give you a vision of the future for maintenance-driven, or rather domain-driven architecture. We're only going to demonstrate the architecture itself, the splitting of the layers out. We're going to talk about organizing code into responsibilities, but we're still going to be missing key pieces that I'll point out near to the end, or at least while we're building out the application. So again, my goal here is to split out the responsibilities. We're going to keep the display logic in this project, the local DB example, but we're going to add a couple of projects to the solution as well. One will be for the orchestration and the business logic. There won't be a whole lot of business logic for this example, but this is where, in that domain layer, that's where our business logic would reside if we had anything a little bit more complex than just give me some records from the persistence layer. And then finally, we're going to build out a project that will be for the persistence logic itself. So let's start right there. I'm going to add two projects to my solution. I'm going to select the solution, go over here to my toolbar and select new project, and make sure right off the bat that you change from create a new solution to add to solution. So we're adding to this existing solution a Visual C# Windows class library, and here we're going to call this first one local DB example dot domain, and we'll click OK. And we'll do the same thing, select the solution one more time, select the new project, button on our toolbar. Make sure we're selected Windows Class Library. We're going to change the solution to add to solution, not create a new solution. And then we want, again, local db example dot persistence. Persistence. There we go. Okay. Now, when we create new class libraries, it's going to give us a class. We'll just want to rename that. For example, what I'm going to rename this to is something called a repository. So we're going to call this customers repository. And we'll talk about the repository pattern and what it's attempting to accomplish in a whole other series. Just follow my naming convention for now. When we're working in the persistence layer, we're going to call our classes customer repository, or user repository, or spaceship repository, whatever the case might be. All right, we'll come back to that. Now in our domain, what we're going to do is call this a manager class. Now there's many different kinds of classes that would sit in a domain. Again, there's what I would call a manager or an orchestration model, and we're going to use that here. So I'm going to rename this to customers or customer manager, something like that. And I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Let's go ahead and change that up. So I don't want to talk about what orchestration is necessarily, but in a nutshell, it is the logic to basically glue all the pieces together. And so the next thing we want to do here is just go ahead and right-click on the solution and select Build Solution, and everything should build right now. The build step is important because we're going to start creating dependencies from one class library or project to another. So for example, the domain layer will what's called take a dependency. That means I need something from you from that particular class library. So you're taking a dependency, and to do that, you right-click References and select Add Reference. You go to the Projects, so Solution Projects tab on the left, and then you select the dependency you need. And so in this particular example, this is one of the ways in which what we're going to build is not going to be realistic, because the dependencies will be pointed in the wrong direction. Everything will be pointed down, when in reality everything should be pointed outwards from the domain layer. Again, that's a topic for another day. We're going to cut corners and we're going to do it the wrong way, but it's good enough for demonstration purposes in this lesson. Okay. All right, so we have that example, and now what we can do is go to our we need one more thing here. We want to create a dependency from our presentation layer down to our domain layer. So I'm going to add a reference from the local DB example, the web project, to the domain layer, like so. And now we should be good there. Let's go ahead and build one more time. I like building a lot. Just make sure everything's good before I go writing a bunch of code. We're going to start in the persistence layer, and the first thing that we need to do is to add an entity data model. Just like we did here previously in the web project, we want to separate this out. Now, I don't think it's you might be able to copy and paste the work that you did here into the other project. I find it easier just to go and recreate it from scratch. So I'm going to select that, and I'm going to go to Project, Add New Item, to get to the Add New Item dialog. And I'm going to select the data filter over on the left, and then choose ADO.NET Entity Data Model. I'm going to call this Acme Entities, just like we did before, and click Add. It's going to open up the Entity Data Model wizard, and I'm going to choose many of the same steps. This is a little tricky step here. It's going to ask whether it should create basically an app config file, which is just like a web config file but used in non-web applications. Should it create that and add the connection string to a key called Acme Entities? I'm going to go ahead and go along with this now, but long term this is not the right solution. Just want to point that out as well. We're taking shortcuts in this lesson. So here it's going to ask me what I want to do with regards to the database. Do I want to copy the database into my persistence project or leave it where it's currently at in the web project? I don't think this matters so much long term. Short term, for development purposes, it might make a difference. What I'm probably going to wind up doing is that I'm going to not copy the file and not modify the connection. So I'm still going to create a connection string in an app config file although even that will not be necessary long term. But it's going to point back to the app data folder in my presentation project. So I'm going to go ahead and click No for now. And then I'm going to go ahead and click the next button. We're going to work with version 6.0. I'm going to go ahead and choose all tables. We only have one, and click Finish. Okay, and after a moment or two, you can see that we get our entities, which looks a lot like the one that our entity model, which looks a lot like the one that we had previously. Let me go ahead and shut all these down, and then open up this one here. So let's get into the customer repository class. Here we are, customer repository class in the persistence layer. So what we want to do here is implement a method called public static list of customer called get customers. So again, what we're going to do is return a list of customers. The customers are defined here in the Acme Entities EDMX. You can see the T4 templates generated this simple class like we saw previously. So we're going to return that up to the caller, to the domain layer. And we're going to make a slight modification to this later, but let's just start off kind of naive and working in this direction. Acme Entities equals new Acme Entities. And then var db customers equals db.customers dot, and then we're going to use toList. And then finally we'll return db customers, like so. Okay, so that should be sufficient to get started. Next up, what we're going to do is make a call to the domain, from the domain layer in our customer manager down to the persistence layer. So here we go. I'm going to create a public static list of customer. Whoops. You can see that I'm fighting IntelliSense. We're running into an issue already. Let me just come back to that in one moment. But because there's no notion of the customer class here in the domain layer, we'll fix that in a second. But what we'll do here is say call this get customers as well. Okay, now back to the matter at hand here. Where are we going to get this customer class? Well, it's been defined in another project, in this persistence project. Now we could, since we have a dependency from the domain layer to the persistence layer, we could use the do something like this, using local DB example, and then we would go persistence dot customer, like so. And we would just have to return, well, let's go ahead and just flesh this out so that we don't get the red squiggly line anymore. So we're going to call into persistence, and I'm just using the namespace here. Ideally I wouldn't have to do that, but just to make things clear where things are being called from. Get customers, var customers equals, and now we're going to return customers. That should work. And it does. Okay, great. So now let's go ahead and think about what we've just done here, though. I'm going to build the project, build it all. Let's build a solution. And it should all work, and it does. But think about what's going on here. I have the customer class defined here in my persistence layer. And I have a dependency from the domain layer to the persistence layer. And it's going to retrieve back to me this customer class. But my goal is for there not to be a dependency from the local DB example, the presentation layer, down to the persistence layer. To get this to work right now, I would have to add a new reference from the presentation layer to the persistence layer, and I don't want to do that. Why? Because now we're back in the same boat. We don't have a clear separation of concerns. In other words, the presentation layer knows way too much about what's going on regarding persistence. In fact, if I were to think about this a little bit more, do I really want the customer manager class to only work with this customer class that's tied to this implementation of the entity framework. What if I wanted to change out and not use the entity framework anymore and I wanted to use, let's say Azure Table Storage instead? Well, now I am bound to working with a persistence layer that can only work with the entity framework. So I want to break that dependency. I don't want, this is called a leaky abstraction. Yes, we've abstracted out and have kind of wrapped the entity framework, but now we're exposing the entity framework's inner workings back up to the other layer, and that's not a great idea. So what we need to do is add one more project. It's going to be called a data transfer object layer, and all the projects will have a dependency on it, but all it does is just define a POCO, a plain old CLR object. In other words, just plain classes that have the same properties as, in many cases, what we're working with in the persistence layer. In some cases, maybe it doesn't. Maybe the shape of the data and the collections are different. But in our purposes, simple purpose, we want to keep it the same. But the purpose of a data transfer object is to allow the easy transfer from one layer to another and to avoid leaky abstractions where the entity framework would be leaked into another layer, whether it be the domain layer or, heaven forbid, the presentation layer. So let's go ahead and add one more project to the mix here. I'm going to select the solution and click Add New Project. Again, I want to add to the solution. I'm going to call this DB, or rather local DB example.dto in all caps. And I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy in the code that I've already have. And yes, it's virtually identical to the class that was created automatically for us in our persistence layer. And to some, this might seem like an unnecessary step, but in order to keep the purity of the layers and the true separation of the concerns and to avoid a leaky abstraction, we've added this data transfer object. So now what I want to do is add a reference in all projects to our new DTO. In fact, let me save it, let me build it, and now it should come up and we should be able to add a reference to it from persistence, add a reference to it from domain, and add take a dependency on it from the presentation layer as well. Now, some people will go as far as to create DTOs for specific interactions between layers. So there would be a specific DTO between domain and persistence and a specific DTO between the presentation layer and the domain layer. It really just depends on your application. And we'll talk about some of those issues in a whole other series. All right, so now that we have those dependencies, let me go ahead and do one more thing here. And I'm going to rename this class to just customer, like that. Okay. So now what we need to do is to transfer, so let's go back to the customer repository. We have this list of customers from the entity framework, but what we really want to do is to convert that customer class, which is coming from the generation of the entity data model, to our plain old CLR, our POCO data transfer object customer. And so to do that, here I'm just going to paste some code in. You can pause the video and catch up with me. And I'll talk about it in one moment, but I need to paste in one more line of code. I'm going to comment out what we're returning there, and instead we're going to return something different. Okay, so here's what I've done. So once I've got my list, once I got my list of customers in my DB customers variable, then what I want to do is for each my way through each customer. Again, these are customers defined in the Acme Entities EDX. And what I want to do is create a new DTO customer object, which is of type DTO customer from our DTO layer. And I'm going to take whatever we had in the data model and copy it to the data transfer object for basically every single property, like so. Then I'm going to add it to the DTO customers collection, and then I'm going to return the entire collection of DTO customer up to the domain layer. Now I'm getting a red squiggly here, and that's because we're still returning the customer defined in the entity DMX. In order to change this, I'm going to go DTO.customer, and that should fix the problem. So now I'm going to right click and select build, and it should build. Great. So we're good to go there. And now let's go back to our customer manager. Again, it's going to orchestrate the retrieval of the list of customers from the persistence layer. You can see that currently we're still working with returning a list of persistence customer from our entity data model. But what we really want to do is return a list of DTO customer to the presentation layer. Okay. And that should be all that we need to do now, because as you can see, the get customers method call to the customer repository already is returning to us a list of DTO customer. Finally, what we need to do now, after we build, let's go ahead and build this. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove that and close that down. Finally, what we need to do in the default.aspx is to comment out this, pretty much everything there. And what we'll do is call into our domain layer. So domain.customermanager.getCustomers. So let's go var customers equals domain.customermanager.getCustomers. We can use that as the data source to our grid view, data bind, and then let's get rid of this result label. And so now we should be able to run the application. Now there's going to be a couple problems as we're getting started here. The first one is that we're going to get this metadata exception, and it's going to be very vague. We could try to view the detail and drill into it a little bit more, but ultimately what the problem is that each type, name, and a schema must be unique. And the problem is that we've not deleted the Acme entities from our original local DB example on the persistence layer. So all I need to do is just delete that. Yes, that's gone. So now this version, the Acme entities EDMX, should be unique. So let's go ahead and go back to local DB example. In fact, I'm going to right click it and select set as starter project and then run it again. Okay, and we get back to where we started. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, what did we gain from all this introduction of complexity into the application? And so we gained several different things. For example, first of all, we have successfully separated our concerns. So all the given responsibilities of the system have been separated into the various layers. The persistence logic is in the persistence layer, domain or orchestration logic is in the domain layer, persistence logic is in the persistence layer, and now we could remove, for example, the persistence layer and put a new one in place. We could remove the presentation layer and put a new one in place, and everything should still work correctly. What else did we accomplish? Well, now all methods in our application have a single responsibility. In the presentation layer, we're merely calling into the domain layer, grabbing results, giving them to components that have display logic. In the persistence layer, we're merely grabbing data from the database and giving it back up to the other layer. So that's another huge benefit. We are applying single responsibility principle to our application. Our methods have one responsibility. Furthermore, if you take a look at the persistence layer, it actually has two responsibilities, and this is something I want to address in just a moment. But all the persistence layer, the get customers method, really knows how to do is grab data from the database. Now we've added this extra step of formatting it into a data transfer object. Let me come back to that in just a moment. Furthermore, all the code here is organized. That's another thing that we've gained from this process. All code has a home. We have to ask ourselves, what is the responsibility that we need to implement next? And we know we have guidance on where to put that code that implements that responsibility. And you might ask yourself, well, why do I need to go through all that effort? Well, let me ask you, why would you go about organizing your garage, assuming that your garage is organized? Mine's not all that organized. Or better yet, maybe why do you organize a kitchen? Why do you put all the spoons and the forks together, the plates, the cups, things of that nature? Well, you do that so that everything has a home and you can move more quickly, which is another benefit of why we're doing it this way. Things are optimized. We're going slow at first and putting things in the right spot so that we can go fast later on. Now we've got a lot of the complexity figured out and out of the way. We can move quicker from this point on and have a clear path in our mind of what we need to do next to implement a given feature. And we'll demonstrate that in the next lesson, where we go to add a feature to our current application, what we have right here, to add new customers to the database. Next of all, it's maintainable. So all the logic to retrieve a list of customers is in one spot. We don't have to find that logic implemented in different web form code behinds. It's all in one place. We make a call to one method, and it goes about the process of figuring out how to get that data back to our presentation layer. And furthermore, a change in the persistence layer or a change in the domain layer will not entirely break the app. But if it does, we can, and here's another benefit of something we gain, we're set up now to introduce unit testing into our application. And what unit testing does for us is that it creates a trustworthy application. We can establish trust that our application will always work even under strange situations. And although we're not going to implement it in this example, we talk about unit testing a lot in the maintenance-driven architecture track on LearnVisualStudio.net's curriculum. Now, what's missing from here, again, is that we don't have the right dependencies set up. As you'll learn in the application architecture fundamentals, that instead of the presentation relying on the domain and the domain relying on the persistence, what really should happen is that everything should rely. So right now all the dependencies are pointing down in this model on screen. But really what should happen is all dependencies should point away from the domain layer. The domain layer is the core of the application. It's going to contain all of our business logic. We could throw away everything else and keep that core domain model for years and years and years, and whatever presentation or persistence technology comes along, we're set for it. Now, in order to manage dependencies in that way, we have to introduce something that's called dependency injection, where we tell the domain layer what it should be depending on for persistence. So we're going to pass in, as we construct the domain layer, we're going to pass in the connection information. How do you get data? Call this persistence layer versus that persistence layer, so we have multiple implementations. And that also is going to help us to build unit testing so that we can isolate just the domain layer code and not have it tied always to one persistence layer. We can give it a fake or a mocked up persistence layer just so we can test that domain layer. Again, a big topic. We'll talk about that later. And then finally, there are some tools that we could be using to take care of several inefficiencies. So for example, this mapping step, which is really something that could be introduced, put into its own method. There's actually a free tool, an open source tool that's out there that will do this mapping for us in one line of code. And so we're missing little things like that that smooth out the process that I didn't want to introduce in order to keep the complexity down. But again, that's something we talk about in that maintenance-driven architecture track. So with all these kind of caveats in place, what we've done here is really set ourselves up for the future to keep our application as maintainable as possible. Yeah, we're not quite there yet, but I wanted to give you a vision again of where we're heading with the maintenance-driven architecture approach to building software. It seems like a lot of complexity up front, but there are huge benefits long term if you follow this discipline and you discipline yourself to add unit tests to make sure that your domain layer is working and things of that nature. All right, I think that's all that I really want to say. It's a very long lesson, I apologize, but it's a very important lesson for giving you a justification why you want to not just stop your training just learning how to drag and drop your way to success or potential failure, that there are other ways and other thought processes that apply in certain situations. When you're building enterprise applications with a lot of logic that have a long development timeline. Okay, so let's go ahead and wrap this up. In the next lesson, we're extending what we're doing here by adding more functionality. We'll see you there. Thank you.